Good afternoon, everyone. Welcome back to another episode of Speaking Legally. And guess what? We're about 50 episodes in, if not this week, next week. So let's hear it for us. We've been rocking and rolling since the midst of COVID, right? And we're here, we're still here. We're actively helping you to address the legal issues that are in our community and understanding what that means with the two legal experts that we have here, speaking legally, where the legal meets the cultural. And we appreciate you being a part of the show, tuning in, sharing this out, and letting us also know that the content has really been valuable in how you understand and are able to advocate for your own rights and know how to get in contact with those who do this professionally and can be there for you in time of need. So welcome back to the show. It's March. We are here. March Madness is beginning. Let's just hope that the weather changes a little bit, at least for those on the East Coast who would like to see spring really come forward. So I'm going to turn it over to my co-host to say hello, and then we're going to get into our show for today. Senor Edward Pichardo Esquire.
Hola, buenas tardes, buenos días, todo el mundo, nuestra querida audiencia. Welcome, everyone. Good day, good afternoon. Welcome to the audience, the lovely audience. We're here today. I think we're going to find, as usual, the content interesting and fulfilling, as well as educational.
Well, I guess that's the segue to say, welcome back, Ed. I know you was on the road. You were doing a little traveling.
Yeah.
The weather took you up north, so I'm glad it swung you back down. And so let's get cracking.
Absolutely. So as we know, there's quite a bit, as always, going on in the news. Hey, John, thank you for tuning in and being a part of today's show. Some breaking news happened over the last week, and we want to definitely have our legal experts here today. Let us know what this means, because legalization of marijuana has come very close to home. So what say you, our two attorneys, on what's happening that New Jersey has finally and officially made marijuana legal? What does that mean for us culturally?
I think it's a sign of the times. We know in the news Cuomo is having some issues, right? So maybe he didn't get a chance to focus on whether or not marijuana should be legalized in New York. Meanwhile, Governor Murphy is doing what he does, pressing forward, making sure he pleases his constituents out there, which was part of his whole campaign. I think there's some do's and don'ts that we need to be aware of, right? So when we talk about legalization on the New Jersey side, we're talking about 6 ounces or less of marijuana, and we're talking about 21 years of age and older for recreational use. That's what we're talking about. We are not talking about the purchasing of marijuana, because although it is legalized in New Jersey, the sale of it hasn't been legalized to the degree that you can just buy it anywhere. There are certain entities that dispensaries that can sell it. They're still working on codifying how that will happen. So if you walk down the street and you try to buy a nickel bag on the corner, you still can get arrested for the sale as versus the possession, because the sale and how they're going to quantify and qualify that has not been hashed out. And so I think that this new turn in the law is going to open up a couple of lanes of litigation. And what I mean by that is, one, because marijuana is being legalized and for recreation use, 21 and older, does that mean that we are done away with the days of I'm stopping you because I smell marijuana in your car, and so therefore I want you now to exit your vehicle, and I want you to exit your vehicle because now I want to search your vehicle? With the legalization of marijuana, we're now in a point in place where you can only get a warning.
Well, I think from what I understand, some of the critics of this new law, and I'm talking about, when I talk about critics, I mean the individuals who already want to make sure that any sort of legalization of marijuana deals with the issue of its former enforcement or over enforcement in the Black community. And, I'm talking about ranging from expungement of prior convictions to also making sure that we remove the ability of law enforcement to continue to criminalize the use. The only issue, though, is when you bring up the example of the smelling in the car, that brings it into the arena of whether the person is, in fact, driving impaired. And that is something, unfortunately, for anyone who, say, is working on legislation to legalize right now, with the absence of legalization on the federal level, it is something that has to be part of the law, because it's federal policy that any legalization on the state level has to prevent an increase in impaired driving based on the use of marijuana. And I'll talk about that in a little bit. I just want to
make, Ed, you bring it up. We could dive into it right now, because this is what this show is about. I think there's 3 different scenarios, or there's many scenarios, and I want to make sure that we stay very focused on the scenario that I was mentioning. 1, you could be in a double parked car is off. Officer tap on your window. You're not driving. I smell marijuana. Get out of the car. That is different from you're driving. You may not have your signal on. You may have switched lanes. He see you swerve, or he fabricates that and then stops you.
Or how about the ignition is on?
And then, right. Well, you're driving, right? And so you have that conversation, and then because that officer either feels some type of way or knows that the stop is for a quota or abuse of power, runs the old "I smell marijuana." Now he's asking you to get out of the car. So there's 2 things that I attach to that. 1, if this is no longer a crime necessarily to use marijuana in a recreation standpoint, you smelling it doesn't presuppose that I have committed a crime because it's legal. The only thing it can suggest is that maybe I'm asking you to get out of the car because I think you're transporting it. And if you're transporting it, then you're doing that on highways and byways, which equals federal terrain. And then it becomes a question of whether you are selling by transporting and using these highways and byways, which is a federal crime. But if there's no indication of that, if you get the dogs and the dogs smell around, then the question becomes is you can no longer ask me to step out of my car if I'm double parked, if the ignition is not on, and you say I smell marijuana, so let me see ID. Which
well now
all the time.
Well, if I may, now it's what you call getting into the weeds. The proof is in the pudding, right? Because
is it weeds or is it weed? Which one is it? Which one?
Weeds.
Okay, we're on the show. I want to make sure we right.
No weeds, no pun intended, right? Because what I'm talking about here for criminal practitioners like you and I, we're thinking, I would imagine, about the DUI scenarios, right? Where the officer stops the vehicle. Could you please step out of the car? The question then becomes, do you do, I believe it's called the nasal nystagmus test, where you are asked to stand on one foot, one leg, touch the nose. Officer looks at your eyes. Are they bloodshot or not? There's a narrative, a legal narrative that takes place with respect to his findings of impairedness. Then you have the next step of, do you do the breathalyzer? Do you then do back at the station the blood alcohol test? And so the question becomes is, with this new legalization, are they now going to create a similar paradigm for the judgment as to whether or not, the determination rather, because courts make judgments, the determination as to whether or not you are impaired, talking about on the alcohol paradigm, 0.08 versus 0.10 versus 0.06, depending on what state you're in. that is what I'm wondering what type of scheme they're going to come up to allow that officer to make that judgment or that determination. Rather, let me go back. I like to use the term so it has. If whether you know that officer now says, okay, you're impaired, because let's say the person says, listen, I smoked a joint earlier this morning. I'm not impaired. I'm fine. You're just smelling it on my clothing. I wasn't intoxicated. I wasn't impaired. And, Royce Russell is representing the young man in court. And now he's arguing that, look, listen, this has to be dismissed. Where's the standards, the evidentiary standards, the legal standards for determining impairedness for probable cause arrest and then onward prosecution? So
I think you're correct that there has to be some type of tier system that is analogous to some litmus test that's analogous to when you're driving impaired, because they do have driving impaired where you're not talking about alcohol, right? They're talking about other narcotics, other drugs, right? So I think that's one lane. What I wanted to make sure is this other lane, this civil rights lane, this lane that says, you know what, I'm stopping you, or I see you pulled over and you say, I'm waiting for my girlfriend, or my wife is just getting off of work, or, I'm waiting for my son to get out of practice. And they say, I smell, they being police officer, law enforcement, say, I smell marijuana, now get out of the car. Or they believe that you shouldn't be driving that car, a BMW or whatever it is. And they say, get out of the car because they say they smell marijuana. So they hide their classism. They hide their quota system. They hide their abuse of power under this guise of I smell something. Now they're going into your trunk. Now they're going into your glove compartment. Now what I'm saying is that you have fertile ground to say, if you smell something and I'm not driving, you give me a ticket. That's what the law says. You give me a warning. You don't give me anything, because we don't even get into the conversation of when I last smoke or not smoke. I'm sitting in my car and I'm waiting for someone. That's it. End the discussion. So I'm going to see how that plays out. I want to see how that plays out in New Jersey. In New York, we know it's not been legalized. And so in New York is, if you're stopped for that, if you're questioned about that, they're going to do what they normally do, which is then move on to the next tiers of what I want to call invasion of privacy by way of searching your vehicle. But, as we speak about that is not really where I see the problems, or at least the police department voicing their concerns. Just doing a little background on how we got to a place where it was legalized and how the governor had to massage certain things. It appears that police are very, very much up in arms in the fact that they cannot, at this point, based upon the new law, call your house, speak to you to tell you that your child who's under the age of 21 possessed marijuana. See, they could do that before, but based on this law, you can't do that. Based upon this law, you have to give the kid what they call a written warning. Then the second time this happens, then is notification to the parents if under the age 18. Then the third time you refer to either some drug treatment programs, some community service, you could be fined for $50, right? That is a far cry different than what the police would do if they caught someone under the age of 18 with marijuana, if it wasn't legal. First thing, in court, parents notification, you become a statistic. We're going to resolve this in the legal system. Now, based upon this law, that is no longer the case. First time, written warning, parents notified or not, no mandatory notification. Second time, notification to the parents. And then third time, you get a fine. You can go to court, some community service. That's for those that are under the age of 18 years old. And so the police have been saying that with this law being passed, you're kind of handcuffing us. And that's interesting that the police are handcuffed, right? Usually it's the other way around, that they're handcuffed in their ability to look out for the community, for those who are underage, and their ability to treat those who are underage who possess marijuana with the threat that we're going to notify your parents, and actually do notify your parents to stop that person from going in a certain direction, a certain spiral going down. At least that's what they argue.
So, Mr. Russell, 1 second. So when they crafted this law, did they not think about the fact that that would be a deterrent for someone who could potentially go down a very dark alley?
Well, what I can tell you is that that was part of the massaging that took place in order for it to pass, right? The main question that was brought to the floor is, all right, if it's no longer a crime, then what do we do? What do we do for those that are under the age 18? Now, those who advocated for it not to be a crime probably won out over those that said, well, let's devise it in the fashion that if you're 21 years or older, it's not a crime. If you're 18 years or younger, let's make it a crime. That didn't go down well, because you're trying to preserve a young person's record, right? So then what's the compromise? The compromise is this 3-tier system that says the first time you get a warning, second time I notify your parents, and third time you actually now present it in front of the court. Could they have done just first time I notify your parents, second time you're brought to court? I would imagine. But, Ed lives in the world of politics. You got to give some cake and don't give him some ice cream, give some cookies and don't give him milk. That's his lobbying world that he lives in. Maybe Ed, you can educate us on how that works on the Capitol Hill up in Albany, how you got to give a little bit of this and give a little bit of that to get your way.
Oh my gosh. I mean, I was around when the Compassionate Care Act of New York passed in 2014. The assembly sponsor was Diane Savino. The Senate sponsor was Diane Savino out of the Senate. She's out of a slice of Brooklyn, Staten Island. And then you had Richard Godfrey out of the Assembly, chair of the Health Committee. I believe he's on the east side of Manhattan. But in any event, very political, divisive situation going on with that. You had people calling for legalization of marijuana. The governor delivered, basically half a loaf, and if not a quarter, by coming up with a very restrictive program that allowed for the manufacturing and dispensing of medical marijuana. Okay, not medical and recreational, just medical. And I believe at that time, New Jersey had already had a medical marijuana program, not as robust as many wanted it to be, but still already had a program before New York. Cuomo follows up with a program very begrudgingly. You could tell it was kind of like, very restrictive. When you looked at the application, I believe at that time there were only 5 licenses being given out. Each one of those 5 licenses allowed you to manufacture and dispense in 4 different locations throughout the state. You had to already show proof of manufacturing facilities, equipment, the ability to produce pharmaceutical grade marijuana with pharmaceutical grade consistency, meaning nothing close to what you get on the street.
125? Is that what you said?
No. Gorilla Glue, Black Magic.
Nothing in Irvington Avenue. Nothing like that. Hey, look. I would. I'm gonna put this. I would imagine that some of that stuff on 125, some of that stuff over on Fordham Road, some of that stuff in Irvington Ave is pharmaceutical grade stuff. You understand what I'm saying? You know what I mean?
Listen, all I'm saying, man, is I went to a room right before the passage of the act where and
you compared the two. It wasn't the same.
Listen, my man, what I'm trying to say is that I was in a room, and it was a presentation that was done by Assemblyman Godfrey, Senator Savino, and I believe it was Alfonso from the governor's office at the time. And they talked about the people that were in that room. There were very few black people in that room, very few people of color in that room. It was a lot of venture capitalists, pharmaceutical industry executives, top level lobbyists, just a lot of like folks that, eat caviar and drink champagne, not no OE or, whatever, what I'm saying? None of that,
Well, the economics and the racism and the classism is always built in. I mean,
so I mentioned all that to say that for me, I think it's very clear that the impetus behind a lot of this legalization is really the money and the revenue and potentially tax revenue that's being looked at, especially during this time of COVID, of diminished tax revenues. Look, I think you have nowhere farther to look than you look at gambling and lotteries. For years, there was hood gambling going on.
You mean running numbers? You mean
the numbers?
You mean double down on the combo?
We used to have a guy named Cabeza that used to come because he had a large head. Cabeza is
wait. Stop, Ed. You mean allegedly.
And so allegedly this individual would come and allegedly ask for the numbers.
Right.
And and folks would be like, I want the 5.
I want the 5 in the joiner. I want the joiner combo in Brooklyn.
Exactly.
Back with the Niter, coming through on the A train. I was like, yo, my man, what is all that? But we know.
Yeah, you had Spanish. You had Spanish Raymond in East Harlem. You got
allegedly Spanish.
Oh, you got the story. Yeah, you got the stories of allegedly Bumpy Johnson and those folks.
Right.
It was a very robust industry. And then all of a sudden now you go to the bodega, give me this ticket, that ticket, give me this. You got people online, legalized gambling, high revenue. You got all these casinos now. Not just in the Indian reservations, Native American reservations, excuse me. And I think, I think a lot of this is driven by revenue. And I just kind of want to
wait. And to your point, when you talk about driven by revenue, right now, what is the kind of bottleneck of the whole implementation in New Jersey as to legalize marijuana is around sale. The sale of it. There's only 13 distributors out in New Jersey, and there's over 100,000 citizens that need it for medical use. So now they're trying to table, if you broaden it to recreation, who's going to sell when, where, and what? And clearly, as you said, as I said before, there's always classism and culture in any argument, right? And you just talked about who was in that room. There wasn't a guy like you and I. You said venture capitalists, pharmaceutical folks, all of that nature. And so it is about the dollar. It is about the revenue. It is about culture, even though they say this is to help the economic, social, and racial divide.
Mm-hmm.
It's called the trickle down effect from Ronald Reagan. I'm still waiting for it to trickle down. You know what I mean? I'm still in the desert because the rain ain't trickled down. That type of deal. All of those things come to play.
So let's pause for a minute as you're going through this. I want to circle back to what you started with explaining this before, so that culturally we understand that this legalization that's happening in New Jersey does not allow the sale of marijuana, because I think we need to get that straight. When marijuana is legal, so folks can just run around and do what they want. This does not protect you from any sort of legal situation if you are caught selling, correct?
So if Ed was to sell me a nickel bag and there was an undercover officer in our high school or on the street and saw that, you have committed a crime in New Jersey. That's it. End of story, right?
And what I was about to say is that's kind of where this comes in. The question is, are we going to see people of color, people like us, getting those dispensary license to be able to legally sell?
And that's the big question, right? And that's why you have the bottleneck, which is going on right now. See, New Jersey hasn't figured out what Evanston in Chicago has figured out. See, what they're doing in Evanston, what they've realized is that not only are we going to tax the sale of marijuana, we're going to make sure people of color are involved in the distribution. And then with that tax, they just most recently passed legislation that says that they're going to use that tax in order to give reparation for the redlining that took place in Evanston back in the day in Chicago that kept Black folks in the 5th district or the 5th ward, and they couldn't really live in the more fertile and white populated areas in Evanston. So now you're going to get a check for $25,000 if you can show your family lineage in reference to being redlined in a county, in a community. And they have figured out a way of saying, all right, we're not going to tax people more. We're not going to change the structure of our taxes, but this new thing that we selling this marijuana and we taxing, that money is going to people of color for reparations. Now that is some forward thinking.
That's amazing. That's really amazing.
Yeah, I also heard something, and I'm not sure if it was a commentary about the New Jersey legislation or another in terms of allowing those who were formerly convicted of marijuana possession and or distribution to also be able to get one of these licenses, because what happens is, and I just want to kind of do a little education lesson and just warn the audience that I'm gonna have to leave the show about maybe 5 minutes before, because I have to attend a virtual court hearing. But in any event, there is this thing called the Cole Memo. The Cole Memo. Cole was a deputy attorney general who sent a memo out to all the U.S. attorneys stating that they did not want the enforcement of anti-marijuana laws in states that had a strict enforcement say system or system for medical and or recreational marijuana dispensation. And so that is what allows the states to be able to legalize while the federal government still makes it illegal and still makes marijuana a Schedule I drug. And so, you know, when we look at these little small things that people want to do on the state level, you have to keep that in mind from a legal perspective until there is complete legalization on the federal level as well. You're still going to have these clumsy attempts at marijuana, cannabis legalization on the state level, because any state system has to be able to assure the feds that there are mechanisms in place to prevent criminal diversion. What I mean by criminal diversion, for the profits of these legalized sale to go to criminal organizations like cartels and gangs. And that's where sometimes when I hear these discussions about people with records, of course, you know, being able to engage in this, I say, man, that's, you know, it's a little dicey. It's right. I'm not saying it's not right to look at it that way, but that's where, you know, that we really need to get cannabis legalized on the federal level. And the hope is that now with the new Biden administration, that is finally going to happen. Because also, I just want to throw something out to the audience too. Even with these legalized marijuana programs like in Jersey now, and even in New York, it's very much a cash and carry system for these dispensaries, because banks most often don't want to touch this stuff. They don't want to set up a bank account for these businesses because banks are federally insured and they do not want to lose their banking license or their FDICs, you know, in terms of whatever regulations that govern that, you know, in terms of insuring their deposits, because they are allowing or serving as a repository for these funds?
Well, what I can tell you, where one door closes, another door opens, right? Somebody's going to take that idea and run with it. Somebody's going to take that idea and open up some type of depository where you can actually put that money somewhere. And there's going to be an insurance company that is going to back that as well. It's not going to take long. When you have venture capitalists in the room, you have pharmaceutical companies in the room, when you have entrepreneurs in the room, and one of the requirements is that you cannot have a criminal record. We see that in New Jersey. You know that'll be the case in New York. I'm sure there's going to be some level of not only criminal record, but as they do in the immigration world, talk about, have you committed any crimes of moral inturpitude? You know what I mean? That is going to be something that's going to be out there in and of itself. So it may not be a crime that's on the books, but did you ever steal? Did you ever cheat on a test? Did you ever do something that wasn't in the honor code? Because if you're talking about cash and you're talking about high financial areas and things of that nature, that's what you're really speaking about, right?
So let's continue. Push your pin in that because we have some questions. Jerry had a question about the weed stores. Will Black folk get them? He's assuming that white folks get geared up in advance. And any evidence that the requirements to own a license work against Black folk, like what you're talking about, bad credit or prior weed conviction. So these are all the questions. And any evidence that they'll go after all the local weed dealers like they went after the numbers runners when Lotto came out. So all great questions, Jerry.
So let me just put it, let me try to put it in four corners. We've seen this when it came down to the legalization of liquor, right? What happened in that vein. When it comes down to numbers, history is bound to repeat itself. Whenever you take something that's illegal, that's very profitable, and try to make it legal. The only difference here is that there is, and I'm going to call it a disguise until I see otherwise, of social justice, of making sure that the playing field is leveled. But when you have organizations like the New Cannabis Regulatory Commission, I'm sure nobody ever heard of that, right? The New Cannabis Regulatory Commission, that is a publication and an association where you can subscribe to magazines and get educated on how to open up a dispensary and it's called the Cannabis Insider. What a wonderful name. Because when I looked at their ads and I looked at them online, the insiders were not people of color. They were people that didn't look like us at all. And they're already talking, they're already having high level conversations as to what it will take to do this. So it's almost as if the Black community gets the stock tip after the stock tip ain't a tip no more. You know what I mean? It's the same phenomenon.
Well, what I noticed with the New York program was that at the time of enactment, you had a lot of the Black legislators who were being asked to vote on this, or legislators of color, vote on this. They were really like saying, hey, listen, this is a very restrictive program. And, are our folks going to be able to apply for these licenses and get them? And I think what happened is, from what I understand, there's some level of participation by some players of color, but it's usually as part of a larger consortium, because there's a lot of pieces in play when it comes to getting one of these licenses, especially on the manufacturing end. You got to have the ability to grow it. You got to have the land to grow it in. You have to have the facilities to process it. And remember, the processing, like I said before, has to be pharmaceutical grade. And I believe there are 4 to 5 strains that are specifically delineated in the regulations of the Compassionate Care Act, New York Medical Marijuana program, that have to be adhered to. So, like I said, it's almost necessary that you have that pharmaceutical partner that is able to deliver that product. And then you have to be able to show that you have a certain level of security in place to be able to protect it, meaning prevent it from being stolen and being redistributed in the black market. And so what I noticed is with a lot of the players that were putting together consortiums that were applying for the licenses, and keep in mind, it went from 5 licenses to now 10, each having 4 different areas of the state where they have dispensaries. So, you know, the components that you have to have in place, and mind you, you have to, in your application, you already have to make your showing that you have all of these things in place already when you coming in the door. Not, I'm going to get it after you give me the license because I'm waiting for, you know, Royce to give me that $1 million loan once the license, once I get the license. They're not trying to even hear that. So I would say the Jerry Graves question, black folk getting this right here, very few. Just you know,
I agree with you when you look at regular black folks. Regular black folks.
Regular black folk, right?
Let's. We're not monolithic in any shape.
No, we're not. Right? We're not.
So
you know,
there are black folks that are hedge fund guys on the financial scene, retired entrepreneurs, investing in whatever. Those are the folks that may not be on the front, but putting the money in. And then the black folks that you talking about, a guy like you and I, you know, a guy who just kind of kicking the can up the street, right? You know, we just regular Eds, as they say, right? You know what I mean? It just happened your last name is Pachado. We're regular Eds, regular Royces. We kicking the can. We get down because they need to show that there's someone of color that's involved. We get down because maybe, you know, if I have this attorney and he does a little sweat equity, then he could be part of the team. If Jerry is asking that type of question, which is like part ownership, silent ownership, a little bit of ownership, then the door might go wide open. But if you're saying black owned ownership, I think Brother Graves has been around long enough to know that that is an uphill climb when you got one shoe and the rope is tethering.
And listen, I remember a few years ago, I just, for the life of me, I can't remember the details, and this memory is coming up because it is because I'm old. Look how great this is. Yeah. So there was an issue some years back in terms of a minority partner basically transferring his interest in one of these companies to a non-minority. And you know that made the, you know, that kind of made the papers because you know, I believe that company had gotten the license because they were able to make an adequate showing that, you know, there was some level of MWBE participation. So you know, that is still a question that's up for grabs, you know, because the license itself is not transferable. But I don't think the law prohibits the transferring of the interest. Like if I got, say, 15, 20, 30% of this, you know, consortium that has a license, and I sell, you know, my shares, my interest, you know, what happens after that? You know, that's going to be an interesting question for the years to come insofar as this equity conversations and us getting a piece of this pie after so many years of going to prison for selling this stuff. You know, the prisons are littered with brothers and sisters who have done time, especially under those onerous Rockefeller drug laws that made, you know, small players be deemed kingpins for purposes of doing ridiculous amounts of time for otherwise non-violent offenses. So those are all interesting questions that are really going to have to be answered, you know.
Addressed. Yeah, absolutely. I just wanted, for the record, Jerry said he's coming to Mr. Russell for the $1 billion loan. But as we talk about this and the implications, this is where the legal meets the cultural. So understanding, yes, a law was passed, but what does that actually mean for people who might not read carefully in between the lines and understand there's a certain amount? You said it was 6 ounces, correct, Mr. Russell?
Yes.
that you can carry. If you are caught in any sort of transaction, you are still going down. So really knowing and being aware of what the law states. And then those who are on the front line of advocating for the reforms and social justice, really highlighting just what you said, Mr. Pichardo, about those who have served time, still serving time for nonviolent offenses that would fall under this. And then the economics of it. Can we really be owners of dispensaries or just the forward face when these things happen? So to be continued. This is a story
let me just add one more point before we close out on this, right? I think it's really important to understand that there's still issues concerning having a medical card for marijuana. For instance, I have a medical card in Jersey. I go to Arizona. Can I buy weed and smoke it there? Anybody know the answer?
I don't think so.
People don't know the answer to that, right? Right? So there are a list of states where if you have a medical card and you go into their state, then you can buy. And I'll just name a few. Arkansas, if you have a medical card from another state, you go in, you can buy. Arizona, New Mexico, Hawaii, Michigan, Maine, New Hampshire. That's just a few.
Yeah, so I don't think you could do that in New York, though.
Exactly. So
they're very strict about that.
We have to be mindful that even though folks have cards, it's like having a license to carry a gun. You have that in Philly. You can't bring that to New York. You have your card in Arkansas. You can't come over here. New Jersey will probably open themselves up to that, because if you legalize marijuana, clearly if you're from Arkansas and you're carrying your card in New Jersey, you go purchase, then you're fine. But we also have to understand that there are limits just on the medical cards and where you can use them. And as I said, there are not enough dispensaries to even manage the hundreds of thousands that have those cards. So we are a far cry from just Black ownership. I have to be frank. That doesn't mean we can't get in where we fit in and, rub the elbows to make it happen.
Yeah, because even with the people who, or rather not the people, the entities who initially got the licenses in the New York program, the first, I believe, year or two, it was already projected that they were going to be operating at a loss in any event because of all of the restrictions in terms of, just the amount of dispensaries that they could have and so forth, and all the requirements. So that also makes it prohibitive too, because unless you are prepared to sustain those losses in the short term and not banking on going in for immediate profit, you're gonna have some issues. You definitely got to be well capitalized to be able to sustain some years of loss, to then, with the hopes of a more expanded program and ability to then profit. But it looks like I'm going to have to step off soon. But
yes, what you do, which is litigating.
Yeah.
So this show is live and in real time, but as we transition from this topic and before you head out to for your client, we do have an update on a case that we talked about before when it came to really understanding what happened in the Breonna Taylor case. We have another situation that is unfolding in regards to, we knew about the no charges, but grand jury records approved for release. What does this really mean?
Well, apparently the AG requested, Letitia James requested release of the minutes, and the judge approved. And so now the lawyers for the police officers are asking to be able to review the AG's request for release, because right now that request for release, or the papers that were filed, are under seal along with the judge's ruling. So this is interesting. This is all very interesting landscape. It harkens back to our conversation of what occurred in the Breonna Taylor case, where in that case there was resistance from the top law enforcement officer in that state regarding the release of the grand jury minutes, and the jurors asked for the release, and then a lawyer for one of those jurors made a motion, and that motion was eventually granted after some, arguments in court, back and forth. So I'm gonna let you kind of discuss that in full, but I just kind of wanted to say that this is a very interesting issue that folks need to look at. The article that you're putting up, I believe, by the Rochester Democrat and Chronicle, also gives a very rich history of the release of grand jury minutes. In fact, AG, former Attorney General Eric Schneiderman had asked for the release of the grand jury minutes from the failed indictment of the prison officials who were involved in the Attica prison riot back in the day. And that, I believe, that release was denied by a judge. And you had attempts to get the Eric Garner grand jury minutes released. And so you have a history of non-release, and now you have release. And so this is interesting for the state of New York.
I think what is, you use the
and
word.
I'm going to go. I got to go. I'm sorry.
All right. No problem,
All right.
You use the word interesting, and we know the definition of it. And I want to make sure that we really drill down on what is interesting about it. Is it interesting about it because we're in a place and time in history where we're seeing more applications being made, at least 2 that we know of in less than 8 months, in reference to having grand jury minutes revealed? Is it interesting because one shows we want to reveal it because we really want to know what happened, Breonna Taylor. We want to know what happened. Why wasn't these officers indicted? What went wrong? Versus interesting as to the Attorney General with Daniel Pruitt. Now remember, both of these individuals are African American, right? African American male, African American woman. Interesting on the other end when we talk about Rochester, in that, is this a show of transparency? Like, I don't know anyone that will volunteer or be a party to or acquiesce to the release of grand jury minutes if it wasn't for, one, quote unquote, true transparency, to say that we put our best foot forward in this particular case and this was the results. Whether somebody views it as that, we'll see if they're ever released and the public gets a chance to look at it. But one is interesting because it was forced, created by the people that sat in the grand jury, that felt the heat of the community, and they were prepared to say, you're not going to lay this at my doorstep, let's have it released, versus release from the person who presented the case to the grand jury, i.e. the office, the Attorney General's office, who presented the case to the grand jury. And I think that they wouldn't want to shoot themselves in the foot by releasing something that was not of a professional grade, did not have transparency and professionalism and what we call best practices available to lend some type of support and faith in the system, even though we've had these facts. This was what was presented, and this was the result. With all that said, let me just finish this one point. With all that said, that brings us back to the greatest 2 non-legal factors that leads any legal proceeding. And I'll say it again, it leads to 2 non-legal factors that lead in any legal proceeding. That's culture and class. Who was the grand jury made of? What was the culture? What was the class? And then what charges were presented? That's the legal factor. That'll determine whether or not something went wrong or this is supposed to be the outcome.
Interesting. I'm going to see if this news story will play.
What's his name? Daniel Pruitt!
To say that this is a surprising outcome would be a lie, but that doesn't make the pain or the anger any less real.
No justice. No peace. No justice. No peace. To see Joe Prude and his family watch this press conference and us not have any answers for them, except for we're going to be right where we started in these streets. So tonight, as we're marching, as people are giving speeches and we're holding space for each other and we're talking about how we feel and how hurt we are, please remember, it's discouraging, but we got to dig deep for more grace and more grit because they are trying to wear us out.
Black people have been just oppressed for too long, and a lot of people have been oppressed for too long. As you can see out here, it's a lot of different races because they can obviously see that the oppression is just it's too much.
January 6, 2021, 99% white men and women get to storm the U.S. Capitol
And walk out.
and met with no resistance.
None.
Left unharmed.
Escorted in.
A black boy can walk down the street and get killed by a cop.
Black girls can get pepper spray.
Babies, black girls, pepper spray.
People want to call us rioters, protesters. We don't give a flying what they call us. We're change makers, we're dreamers, and we're fighters.
It would be hard to fight hate with love when the one that you're trying to show the love to is only expressing hate back to you.
And here's the reality. Most of y'all, life will go on. The Prude family life it stopped. It stopped. March 30th, it stopped.
This movement has been created for us, led by us, and we will continue to keep fighting. So please do not feel shame. Do not feel sad. Do not feel like we're not winning because we are. The fact that we're still here, the fact that we are alive and in community and fighting and resilience, this right here is a win they can never take away from us.
So
Now,
we can.
What would be interesting is that in having an understanding of how we got to this place, that would be ultimately like the highlight, right? And for those that don't remember Daniel Prude, and I'll just say this before we end, Daniel Prude, he had some mental challenges. He was naked. He had no clothes on. His family called the police to help out. This is once again what we talk about. You call the police to help, and something. Their mentality is not there to assist, to de-escalate, is there to escalate and be hostile. And so he was handcuffed, and allegedly he was spitting at the officers, and they put this draconian spit bag on him, which is no different than a Ziploc bag, and put it over his face. And not just by placing it over his face, he suffocated. Somebody suffocated him. Point blank. Can't get into all the details because I was not there, but somebody suffocated him. Allegedly, a law enforcement officer suffocated him. He could not suffocate himself because he was handcuffed. You'll see images of him sitting in the street with the bag over his head, arms behind his back, talking about God. So I'm really interested in how we get to the place that we get to right now, knowing what I know about negligent homicide, knowing what I know about, reckless homicide, knowing what I know about as a former prosecutor, as a defense counsel, state and federal, what the law states. How do we get to this place? And who was made up of that grand jury?
It's
because not too long ago, 1947, in Peyton v. Mississippi, an African-American male was indicted, was sentenced by an all-white grand jury in a town where 12,000 Black folks lived out of 35,000, and there were more than somewhere between 25 to 250 qualified Black folks to serve on the grand jury and also serve as jurors. So I'm really interested in cultural and what was this presentation, who was sitting in those seats.
Absolutely. Tony said foolishness. Yeah, I think we're all a little beyond the words to adequately express what we feel and the repeated trauma that we experience every time not only these unfortunate situations happen, but then we see it play out as the trial and the media and everybody else highlights much of what you're talking about. What's the real story? Who was there? Who's asking those questions that help us to get to the answers that we need for real reform and not just wishing it would happen? I mean, you know, you look at some of the things we highlighted in our Black History Month show about cases that are over 40, 50, 100 years old. It's like this Groundhog Day movie that we keep seeing this play over and over and over again. And we really hope that with the real pressure on the ground, that it's sustained. You, as we heard in the voices of those in that last clip, not to get tired, you know, and not to get worn out with fighting for justice and equality across the board. So we're able to bring you these stories and conversations. And, you know, sometimes something does come from the uproar, Tony. I might have to disagree with you on that, but it takes a lot to get there. I feel you, my brother. So
well, we have to be careful with language, right? Uproar. What are we talking about? Are we talking about feet in the street? Is that the uproar? Or are we talking about not raising our hands when it comes down to being a juror? Is that the uproar? Uproar is a conclusion. The implementation of it can be highly sophisticated. And next week, I think right now into next week is jury selection in reference to the George Floyd prosecution of the officers concerning George Floyd. Are we going to be watching Snowfall on Hulu? Or are we going to be watching the trial and digging in like we digged in when it came down to Rodney King, or when it came down to O.J. Simpson, or when it came down to Amadou Diallo, when it comes down to some of the cases that we need to focus on? You know, yeah, the uproar, if you're uproaring like a cat, I get it. It ain't happening. If you're uproaring like a lion and it's sustained and prolonged and it's viewed and shown in different ways, then we may get somewhere. But these are the things that's on the forefront in our community. And as we marched in every other town, it is always amazing to me that when it comes down to New York and the state of New York, the media mecca, that stories get lost and they never get, you know, it never reaches its heights, such as a Trayvon Martin, such as a Michael Brown, such as a George Floyd, Breonna Taylor. It just gets lost in the wind somewhere.
I see they're doing their part in Rochester, but they need everybody else to share in getting the story out. And to your point, making it as loud as we can when we saw what happened in these other cases, and where injustice, unfortunately, is a movie that we've watched one too many times. But as we always say on this show, hope springs eternal, that the work is not in vain, that having two attorneys like yourself and Mr. Pichardo, we can continue to advocate for the rights of those in our community and also help our community to understand how they can be well equipped with the choices and decisions that they make and know where to go for resolution if they are a victim of anything, particularly in the areas of criminal, civil, immigration law, labor law. This is what these two attorneys do. So they can be contacted, as you see, RoyceRussellEsquire.com or law office of EdwardPichardo.com. So we thank you for tuning into the show, for sharing your feedback on today's stories. There's a whole lot more to discuss as we see what's unfolding in this month of March. We hope that all of you stay safe and stay well. COVID-19 has not disappeared. And while vaccinations are happening and people are feeling comfortable about receiving the vaccine, there's still a lot of unknowns. So use wisdom and protect yourself and do the things that will help you get back home daily on a safe road, right? Because we see what we're talking about in these stories where you could be minding your business and something still happened to you. But let's take care of ourselves, the things that we can control, and be able to meet again next week, same time, same place, 4 p.m. Eastern Standard. We look forward to having you there. Mr. Russell, any final words? As we know, Mr. Pichardo had to go and do what you all do, litigate for us.
Yes. I would just say that, you know, as we look at the social injustice that there's always, you know, kind of been in our community, that any movement has to be transcending and has to be cross-sectional. So when I see those professional sports or those in professional sports having a platform and saying, I'm not going to play for a certain team because the owner or folks involved in that organization don't really see me for who I am as a person of color, as a person of a certain community, and not invested in changing and doing something that is positive. I think when you start seeing that as a regular means of decision making, as a factor in deciding one over the other, and letting cultural issues really kind of steer you in a way of how you move, then you start to see the change, because then it becomes economics. And when economics hit the forefront, everybody wakes up.
Absolutely. Absolutely. Well, thank you all for tuning in. Take care. And thank you, Rolanda. Great to see you as well. Everyone that has shared, that has commented, that has shown up today, we appreciate you. There would be no show without all of you. So thank you so much for tuning in, and we'll see you next week. Bye-bye for now.